And I just want to give you a brief introduction of Ken Miller. You have to come tonight for the long form of the introduction. All right. So I think many of you know why you're here and know who Ken Miller is. You know, he is a professor emeritus at Brown. And this is actually where he did his undergraduate. So he got to come back there. He's had an illustrious career, starting out in deep research in cell biology and looking at membranes and so on, but then shifted over into dealing with these really important issues about evolution and its implications in society and so on. So, I mean, I could go over a lot of these things, but I'll save that for tonight. 21 total honors and awards that I will discuss in detail. But I just want to just mention that, you know, I mean, he's been very involved in the issues of education and interactions in terms of teaching evolution to diverse communities. And he served as a member of the National Center for Science Education for many years. And since 2017, he's been the president of that. So he comes with great credentials. I don't think I have to tell you more. Want to let Ken get this started with a bit of an introduction, and then we'll go into a discussion.
Thanks a lot. Appreciate it. Nothing scarier than getting applauded before you say it. So you may live to regret that. So this is, a friend tells me it's supposed to be a discussion, and I want it to be such. But I want to give a brief introduction, especially for those of you who don't really know me in one sense or another. And the first thing is, although I'm a cell biologist and my work involves biological membrane structure, protein structure, energy transduction, and that sort of stuff, I've also been a teacher for 48 years. And in that time, in addition to teaching graduate and upper level courses in cell and molecular biology, I've always insisted on teaching the freshman biology course. So at my university, that was a course of about 400 students. That involves lecturing in front of large groups. I have naturally an army of TAs. You can see me conferring with some of them down here, including one of my TAs has a real deer in the headlight look, this sort of thing. And I always insisted on teaching some of the laboratory sections myself, despite the size of the class, because I wanted to get in there and understand what student issues were and so forth. Now, how did I get involved in evolution, being someone whose primary work is with the electron microscope? And this is a freeze fracture picture of spinach thylakoid membranes. This is involved in energy transduction. Boy, could I go on about this. But in 1982, I was kind of on a roll. This was the year I came up for tenure. I had a single author paper that was on the cover of Nature, and a couple of years later, another one on the cover of Cell. And for someone in cell biology, that's hitting the jackpot twice in terms of building a scientific reputation. So I'm a very happy guy. Things are going along really well. And then I get a phone call. And the phone call is actually from a former student of mine who had been a TA and also took, my electron microscope techniques course. His name is Joe Levine. And for a variety of reasons, he says, hey, I'm going to write a high school biology textbook for a famous publisher, but I can't write it all. Do you want to write half of it? And my first reaction was, and I'm cleaning this up quite a bit, is to say, what are you, nuts? I'm a New Jersey guy. Joe is a New York guy. We tend to talk rather coarsely. I actually suggested that he perform an unnatural sex act on himself. So look, I'm looking up for tenure, man. If word got out I was writing a textbook, let alone a school textbook, that would be a net negative. So go away, go away. Well, Joe, long story, and I'm happy to tell the long story for anybody who's interested. He talked me into it. And a mere 8 years later, that was the result, affectionately known as the Elephant Book. Neither Joe nor I knew anything about book marketing, school publishing, anything like that. But when this came out, which is 1990, it was actually the only high school textbook that was written by two working scientists. The other ones were largely written by editors or text production houses and that sort of stuff. And for all its rough spots, it had a lot. It had an authentic voice. And it simply took off. And it ended up everywhere in the country. I live in a small town called Rehoboth, Massachusetts. And both of my daughters went to Dighton Rehoboth Regional High School. My oldest daughter, Lauren, managed to escape DR High School before my book came out. My youngest daughter, Tracy, not so lucky. Lauren actually reviewed my manuscript for me to make sure it was suitable for 13 and 14-year-old kids. And I guess it had a good effect on Lauren, because today she is a wildlife biologist who works for the Nature Conservancy and the Coastal Resources Department of the state of Rhode Island, doing her dream job. Tracy, on the other hand, had to suffer the indignity of using her old man's book in high school. And I always tell people that Tracy is the daughter of whom I do not speak, because today she's a history teacher. That's the effect my text has on people. The other thing is, Rehoboth is a really small town of 8,000 people. And a lot of people in town knew what I did, knew me, but it wasn't because of what I did for a living. It's because I was kind of like the commissioner of the girls' softball program. Being an old baseball player myself, but only having daughters, I figured, let's go with softball. So I ran the spaghetti suppers to raise money. I coached one of our all-star teams, so they kind of knew me as the softball guy. But one day, high school adopts that book, my picture's inside, my name's on the cover, and I drive into high school about a month into that school year. And there's a woman I know from softball, another coach, Bonnie Kelly, and she flags me down. And I roll down the window of my pickup truck and say, Bonnie, what's going on? She says, you wrote the book they use in the high school now. And, what do you say? I puffed out my chest. I prepared to receive a compliment. I said, yes, Bonnie, I did. And she goes, funny thing is, you don't seem that smart. So I've always regarded that as the best compliment I have ever gotten, in one respect or another. But in any event, the book had an impression. And I know as a fact that several of your faculty used it in high school because they told me so last night at dinner. And science doesn't stand still. So every 5 or 6 years, at least, you got to tear up the table of contents and start over again. And we did. And we did. And we did. And we did. So my suspicion is that to many university students in the audience, one or more of these books may look familiar. And it may bring back very unhappy memories of lugging this big book around in high school. And for that, I apologize. Now, why does this have anything to do with evolution? Well, Joe Levine and I have both always regarded evolution as a central organizing principle of biology. We also always regard biology as being non-political. Hey, come on, it's just science. Everybody loves science. But we very quickly discovered that because of the strong treatment of evolution in our textbook, we were going to be attacked. And we were attacked by state boards of education, elected officials, people in the community, churchmen, all sorts of stuff. And that led me time and time again to speak out, partially in defense of our textbook, but I was willing to defend anybody else's textbook as well in terms of the way in which it taught evolution. That led me basically to sit down and write a series of books for the public to try to explain evolution. The first one is called Finding Darwin's God, subtitled is Scientists Search for Common Ground Between God and Evolution. The second one, Only a Theory, was really about evolution and politics. And my most recent book, The Human Instinct, How We Evolved to Have Reason, Consciousness, and Free Will, is about evolution and humanism in one sense or another. And one way or another, I sort of got drawn into this fight, and I thought it was important. And it's important because even today, anti-evolution resources are everywhere. Even, for example, in a movie narrated by Ben Stein, in which he argues that evolution doesn't hold scientific water, which I found for an intelligent person absolutely astonishing. And the result is that anti-evolution sentiment, even today in the United States, is pervasive. Now, this is a study from a long time ago, but it's still pretty much valid as to where Americans stand in the world in terms of their acceptance of evolution. And if you accept evolution, you're in the blue. If you reject it, you're in the red. And if you're not sure, you're in the yellow. Well, right at the top are the Scandinavian countries, Iceland, Denmark, and Sweden. Where is the US? We're right there. And at the time, I had a Turkish graduate student as one of my TAs. And I was in my lab and I was reading this issue of Science. And I saw the graph and I saw him outside. And I said, Atur, come here, you gotta see this. And I showed him that chart and he put his face in his hands, being from Turkey and in great despair. And he said, I'm so ashamed. We couldn't even beat the United States. Because Turkey is the one country we stood higher than. That might have improved a bit, but it's still controversial in the current year. Texas just did a statewide science textbook adoption, and quite a few of the school districts picked our textbook. I'm very, very proud of that. I love Texas. I have a lot of friends in the state, in the universities and high schools. But then one of the school districts, followed by several others, decided to do something strange. This is the Cypress Fairbanks School District. Cypress Fairbanks is a high-achieving school district in an affluent suburb of Houston. And the school board got a look at the textbooks that their teachers had selected and decided there were controversial topics in those books, and they were going to scrub them from the website for the books so students couldn't read those chapters. And you might be surprised as to who wrote that book. It's us. This is the Texas version. And basically, they voted to remove 3 items from the biology curriculum. One was a chapter on human evolution. Can anybody guess what other topics they might have found controversial? Go ahead, yeah.
Probably anything to do with like, with sexual reproduction or anything like
Oh, they like the sex. Anybody else?
Immune response.
The immune system. They didn't like vaccines.
that.
And there's a large section on that, so that's number 2. Now, number 3, remember, this is Texas. This should be obvious. This should be a slam dunk. What's the other topic they don't want to hear about?
Climate change.
Bingo, climate change. So the interesting thing, and people in the community begun to realize this, even if they take them off the website for the book, there's still a physical book that the students have. And I don't know about you, but I used to be a smart-ass 14-year-old. And if Miss Jones, my teacher, said, Kenny, whatever you do, don't go home tonight and read chapter 12. What do you think I'm gonna read? So I don't know how this will work out. But again, this political sensitivity to what I regard as straightforward science is astonishing. And what's driving that? Well, in almost all cases, I have to be honest, even as a person of faith, that the driving force is religious opposition to evolution. And one of my own students, after a lecture a few years ago, this is the intro course. I give 2 lectures specifically on Darwin's theory and quite a few others that involve evolution, came up to me and gave me this book because she'd seen me at church. And she says, as a Christian, you can't accept evolution, and here's why. Now, if you don't know the name, Ken Ham is the guy behind the Ark Park in Kentucky and the Creation Museum. And I want you to think, even if you're not a Christian, think about the symmetry here, the symbolism. Evolution is depicted as the apple in the mouth of the serpent. And that's the ultimate betrayal, is evolution. And if you're a faithful Christian, that's very offensive symbolic representation. Now, there's another issue as well besides this, and this is something that my buddy at North Carolina A&T, Joe Graves, has really impressed upon me. And that is, this is particularly a problem for many people of African descent. And I even found scholarship in Africa, in Zimbabwe, pointing out that racial misconceptions of evolution predict opposition to the theory of evolution among university students in Zimbabwe. And the reason for that is because there are offensive anti-African racial stereotypes that depict people of African ancestry as being closer to our primate ancestries than white people, which is absolutely biologically false. But nonetheless, that even permeates Africa. And it certainly permeates many African-American students, especially those raised in the church tradition in the United States, and basically primes their opposition to evolution. And for any of you who are interested in this, I cannot endorse strongly enough Joe Graves' book, Racism, Not Race, where he dissects biological arguments that underpin racism in this country and actually around the world with the lens of an evolutionary biologist.
And Joe has spoken here.
Joe has spoken here. Joe has taught here, and I had breakfast with Joe this morning. And again, this, he's also, he blushes when I tell him this. He's also a really terrific writer. In addition to being good scholarship, this is a page turner. It's a very readable book. So I recommend it to anyone. So how do I try to treat evolution? This is from one of our textbooks. I'll do this very quickly because again, I want this to be a discussion. We try to develop Darwin's theory of evolution, not by being dogmatic and saying, okay, kids, here's the way it is, but to say, let's transport ourselves to the middle of the 19th century. And let's try to accompany Darwin on his voyage around the world and think about how his ideas developed. Darwin took 2 books with him on the Beagle. One was Lyell's Principles of Geology, and the other one was his Bible. And Darwin set foot on the Beagle as a dyed-in-the-wool creationist and got off the Beagle with enormous doubts in terms of what was going on. So we try to assemble the case historically. And because I want to be brief, I can't go into everything. But one of the things I wanted to display was by doing it historically, it allows students to see how the theory of evolution developed and why it was a scientific necessity. Now, this is not in any of my textbooks, but I always teach this. Darwin wrote a lot of letters and he kept them. And when he was deciding, now remember, all of you college students have to think about this. He's a recent college grad. He has no job prospects, and he's being offered an unpaid internship. Does that sound familiar? The unpaid internship was as naturalist on this boat. And every time he had to make a decision, he wrote down pluses and minuses. And we kept it, or he kept it, on his decision to get on the Beagle. By the way, when he decided to get married, he made the same list. And I should show you that list, but it's kind of off topic. It's really hilarious. It's kind of off topic. So you can't read the handwriting, but he said this voyage would be disreputable to my character as a clergyman. Yeah, probably true. It would be a wild scheme. It was. And he says, you know, this may have occurred to some of you being offered a job. They probably offered it to others before me and they turned them down. So I'm like a bottom choice. And it would be a useless undertaking. And that's my favorite one. He worried it would be useless. Yeah, really? Are you kidding me? This was a 3-year voyage. He was seasick most of the time, but he wrote. He kept a journal. And that journal became the Voyage of the Beagle. Now, there's no evolution in the Voyage of the Beagle, which by the way was sort of a bestseller in Britain, but there's speculation. I want to show you what it is. For the first time in his life, he'd never set foot off the British Isles. So he goes to South America and he sees an armadillo. How many of you have seen, or better yet, touched an armadillo? Oh, excellent. That's very good. They're very strange animals. And you know, they almost look reptilian. They feel I kind of like them actually, but a lot of people find them creepy. So Darwin saw this for the first time, and his first thought was, why should these animals only be found in South America? Then, horning in on some excavations for a railway, he discovered ancient fossils of a creature he called the glyptodon. These fossils are like giant armadillos. They're about the size of a Volkswagen Beetle, no kidding. But they're clearly are related to armadillos. So he goes into this thought. Why should extinct armadillo-like species and today's armadillos be only found on that one continent? It's almost like ancestor descendant, which was his speculation. Here's actually a skeleton that he collected. It's in the British Museum. I got to go in there, and every specimen in the British Museum has an accession tag saying where it was found and by whom. And I was permitted under glass to see the accession tag. It's in Darwin's handwriting, and it's signed, and it says where he found it and when he found it. It's just extraordinary. In this case, this is another one of the giant sloth Mylodon. Darwin found this. Modern sloth looks something like this. And again, he finds this thing. We only find this creature in Central and South America. We only find these fossils in Central and South America. What's going on? So here's what he writes in the Voyage of the Beagle. And this is why I like people to see the development of the idea. This wonderful relationship in the same consonant between the dead and the living will, I do not doubt, show more light on the appearance of organic beings on our earth and their disappearance than any other class of facts. This is a guy, without using a word, who's thinking about the word evolution to explain what he is seeing. As a biologist, what is my advice to teachers and prospective teachers? Evolution permeates biology, and that's how we have to teach it. When we talk about the diversity of life, we should display them in an evolutionary relationship. We should apply evolution not just to explicit chapters on evolution, but to when we talk about human physiology, about the circulatory system, about the respiratory system, and so forth. I think that's important. However, evolution, we have to recognize as educators, is still controversial. And here's my 2 cents before we all get together and talk about this. I think it's important, first of all, to teach the science. Show our students the evidence and then the theories that unify and explain these facts. There's a general misconception among students and the general public that facts are things we're sure of and theories are things we're a little queasy about. That's not the right relationships. Theories never become facts. Theories explain facts. So the example I always like to use is atomic theory. The fact that we use the word atomic theory, does that mean it's just a theory, meaning just a guess that atoms exist? The answer is of course not. Rather, what atomic theory is a series of explanations that ties together thousands of verified experimental facts. So what a theory does is to unify facts into a single explanation. And that's exactly what evolutionary theory does. Second, you can't shy away from controversy. You can't soft pedal it. If the science points in a clear direction, we have to say so as educators. And then we have to remember something else. And all too often we forget this, that science is not in the business of politics or religion. And I think we have to leave the implications of science to our students. And I'll be more explicit about this in a second. So the purpose of science is not to compel belief, it's to promote understanding. So even teaching where I do, I have 3 or 4 students a year who will come to my office and in a nice, polite, because they're freshmen, of course, so they're always polite, a nice, polite, roundabout way, they want to ask me, do I have to believe in evolution to get an A in your class? And in one case, I had just finished intermediary metabolism, and they were concerned that evolution was coming up next. And I said, no, what did I talk about today? And she said, you talked about the Krebs cycle. And I said, I did. I want to tell you something. I don't believe in the Krebs cycle. He goes, what? You don't believe in the, I said, I don't believe in the Krebs cycle. Rather, I understand the position of the Krebs cycle in metabolic pathways. I understand the evidence for it, and I understand why the scientific community finds it persuasive. So I accept the Krebs cycle as the best explanation we have for intermediary metabolism. That's not the same as belief. And do you know what? I'm going to apply the same standard to evolution. You can't be an educated person without understanding the evolutionary explanations for the diversity of life. And that's all I want you to do is to understand. We have to make sure that students don't see evolution as a subject that places their most closely held beliefs at issue. We can't throw students up against the wall and say you have to believe, because there are so many students who believe with all sincerity that they would lose their immortal souls if they accepted the idea of evolution. Even worse, and I put that with tongue in cheek, they would lose their identification with their subject, with their church, with their family, with people whom they love and respect. And finally, we have to emphasize the way in which scientific ideas are developed. And that is not ex cathedra. We don't simply say that's the way it is. We don't develop scientific ideas from pre-existing belief, but rather from observation and experiment. And I've been asked point blank, if there was evidence that invalidated the theory of evolution, would you give it up? And the answer is, of course. And we do that all the time in science. We discard one idea after another. Science is never a mechanism for proving anything. Rather, it is a mechanism for disproving ideas that don't meet the test of reality. And I think as educators, that's what we have to do. All of you, in one sense or another, are educators. Even if you're your students right now, you're still educating other people. And I think that role is important to all of us who are committed in science and all of us who are committed, frankly, and I don't want to get too romantic about this, to understanding the truth about existence and the truth about nature. So that's my introduction, and thank you for listening. I'd like to take questions or suggestions and promote a discussion. Sir?
Along the same line.
Yeah,
In my intro lecture in teaching intro genetics, always had this line: in science, all truth is tentative.
did you hear it in the back of the room? Okay, in teaching intro genetics, all truth is tentative. And that's absolutely correct. I mean, I've been a cell biologist long enough to know all the things that we didn't know about the cell. And for example, this year's Nobel Prize, if you were to take a course in molecular biology, which I did in grad school in the early 70s, I would have been told messenger RNA is the only really important kind of RNA there is. Last week, Nobel Prize was awarded for work on microRNAs. A few years before that, Craig Mello, who's actually a former student of mine, won the Nobel Prize for small interfering RNA. We now know there is a jumble of little bitty RNA molecules that interact at all levels of gene expression. We didn't know that when I began my scientific career, and it's just one example of the hypotheses that we have to either complicate or discard because they're simply not there. So again, all truth is tentative in science. It's a good point to make. Other ideas? Yeah.
Yeah, you said you made this statement that scientific ideas don't stem from previous beliefs, but there's, in the STS field, science and technology studies field, and feminist epistemologies of science, that really our perspective and our worldview and our standpoints do really inform how we look at science. Could you comment on that
Okay.
a little bit?
Very good. So when I said scientific ideas don't stem from pre-existing beliefs, perhaps I should have written should not come from pre-existing beliefs. In fact, all of us grow up in a culture of one sort or another. All of us grow up with preconceptions of one type or another. And the goal of science is not to pretend that those preconceptions or cultural ideas don't exist, but the goal, frankly, is to transcend them wherever possible and to use nature as the ultimate judge. No one is ever, I think, 100% successful in doing that. All of us have to recognize that we have a cultural burden that we bring along with us, and we all have to try as best we can to transcend us. But I'd make one other observation. Let's suppose, for the sake of argument, that I was invited to Japan as a guest lecturer. Japan, of course, is an advanced country, but it has an entirely different culture than we have in America or in other European cultures. If I was asked to lecture about music or art or history, not that I know very much about those disciplines, I'd have to go there in a completely different context because the Japanese view of art and music, and certainly of history, is really quite different from the Western view. But if I was asked to go there and lecture about cellular biology, I wouldn't have to change a thing. And the reason for that, I would argue, is that science is the closest thing we have on this planet. It's not universal, but it's the closest thing we have on this planet to a universal culture, in the sense that I can speak to someone in just about any culture about the structure of hemoglobin or the reaction rate of an enzyme, and it's not culturally burdened. The reason I might have chosen to investigate this problem or another problem might have a lot to do with culture, society, and funding, but it doesn't necessarily drive the science. You want to follow up?
Maybe a little bit. But,
Sure.
scientific field arguably has been dominated by Western
Absolutely.
white males. And one of the reasons for diversifying it is because you do have these different cultural ways of looking at the world. And that can give you even more understanding of a scientific perspective. So instead of transcending it, I think it's embracing those different ways of looking at science. Does that make any sense, or does that resonate with you?
It certainly resonates with me. There are a zillion ways to approach science, but I want to give you in response to that, what I've always considered to be a counterfactual example. And that is the discovery of the double helix by Watson and Franklin and Crick. And of course, when the Nobel Prize for that work was finally awarded, unfortunately, Rosalind Franklin had died. And the Nobel Prize is never given posthumously. It was given to her associate, Francis Wilkins. I have been fortunate enough to know Don Casper at Brandeis University, who was Franklin's last grad student. So I've been able to speak openly with people who knew Franklin really, really well. And they regarded Wilkins as a placeholder for the prize. But here's the deal. Even if you read James Watson's very slanted book, The Double Helix, you see something interesting. And that is the stereotype of male science, white, male, Western science, as you might describe it, is science is coldly rational, step-by-step, extremely logical. The stereotype among female scientists, or perhaps even scientists from the third world, would be they're more intuitive in terms of how they go about doing science. In Watson and Franklin, the roles were reversed. Franklin was the systematic one who refused to make intuitive guesses and insisted on nailing everything down. Watson, on the other hand, was almost a dilettante in terms of flitting from one idea to another until he found the evidence that supported one of his ideas. So in that respect, the more intuitive thinker turned out to be the male, and the more logical step-by-step thinker turned out to be the female. My argument would be that science is a human activity and it takes all types. And what I mean by all types is there's no one way of thinking or proceeding that works every time in science. And my argument for diversity would simply be that we need more brains, meaning more people coming from different backgrounds with different approaches to make science as whole as possible. So that's my response. Other questions or observations about your own teaching? Yeah.
So you mentioned the biggest barrier for is for like understanding evolution is religion. So I'm a Christian myself, and so I have kind of had to wrestle with that as well.
I think all people of faith have to.
Yeah. How do you approach a student, and when they say, look, I understand your class, but I don't want to like lose my faith or worried for my eternal life in believing evolution, because that's not what I was raised to believe. That's not what the Bible says. How do you approach that?
Well, there's a couple of answers to that. The first one is I have to confess something. And that is I got a really easy way out, which is I'm a Roman Catholic. And you'll see what I mean. If you're not a Catholic, you see what I mean. In fact, I am the faculty trustee of the Thomas Becket Foundation that supports the Catholic chaplaincy at my university. Okay. I've also been given an embarrassing number of awards from Catholic universities. I apologize for them. And the reason that I have an easy way out is because 4 popes, beginning with Pius XII, have written that there really is no problem to a Catholic accepting evolution. Pius XII did it. Pope Paul VI did it. John Paul II was explicit in this, and most recently Pope Francis mentioned, of course, the Big Bang and evolution are real. And many people either don't know or forget that the current Pope Francis was actually trained as a chemist before he entered the seminary. So he is really scientifically literate. And if you read his writings on the environment, that'll be immediately apparent. So that's the easy way out for me.
Yeah.
But the other way I would put it is this, and that is, how does one understand scripture? When was the book of Genesis written? Well, the first thing is that it was written in a pre-scientific age to appeal to a pre-scientific people. Now, I don't mean ignorant. I don't mean stupid. I don't mean any of that. But what I mean is the concept of empirical science simply did not exist. John Calvin, certainly no Catholic, John Calvin wrote a book on the interpretation of Genesis. And I can't get the wording exactly, but at Calvin's time, he wasn't writing about evolution, but at Calvin's time, it was perfectly clear that the sun was a source of illumination and the moon was not. the moon was merely a reflector of the sun's light. And Calvin wrote that basically when scripture says God created a great light to illuminate the day and a lesser light to illuminate the night, which comes out of Genesis, if you were then to say, but that's wrong, the moon is not a lesser light, it has no light other than that of the sun. Does that contradict the message in Genesis? And Calvin says that if Genesis had been written with modern astronomy cognizant of its authors, it would not have had the intended effect upon its intended audience. So it is a document written in the language of the time to appeal to the people at the time. And what is the goal of Genesis? In my view as a Christian, the goal of Genesis is to illustrate the relationship between creator and created. And in this particular case, what Genesis says is that creation is good and the source of sin is not, as the Babylonians and the Sumerians believe, the clash between evil spirits and good spirits, but rather is a result of mankind's rejection of God's law. And that's the figurative rejection that you see in Genesis. Many people who insist on taking it really literally are actually surprised when they take a human anatomy class and discover, no, men and women have the same number of ribs. Surprise, and to hold scripture up as a scientific document, in my view, is to profane it. Because as you heard, all scientific truth is tentative and subject to disproof. As Christians, we don't want to hold scripture up to an empirical test because that's simply not the purpose. The other thing that I like to quote, especially when I'm speaking to predominantly Protestant audiences, is a writer who's universally regarded by all Christian denominations as enlightened, and that is St. Augustine. And Augustine wrote a book called On the Literal Meaning of Genesis. And if you read it, which I have many times, you'll see that he is a biblical literalist from his point of view. What does this mean? What does that mean? But then he has a passage which is marvelous, where he says, even a non-Christian can know something about the nature of rocks, stars, the transition of the season, the movements of tides. And these he holds as being true from reason and experience. Then he writes, it is a dangerous and disgraceful thing for a non-believer to hear a Christian talking nonsense on these topics. And we must take all effort to prevent it, lest they laugh the Christian to scorn. So what he was talking about is even if you're not a person of faith, you can study rocks, living things. In other words, you can do science. And if you do science based on the world and you hear a Christian talking scientific nonsense because they think it's in scripture, that undermines the whole of Christian faith. So my feeling is very simple, and that is Christianity is first of all a religion about the truth. So your first question about evolution should not be, does it contradict the Gospels of John, Matthew, Mark, and Luke? Don't want to short Luke. Or does it contradict the writings of Paul? And that should not be your first question. Your first question should be, is it true? And if it is true, how can we understand it within our belief system? And I think we can understand it in a belief system where God commanded the world to be fruitful and multiply. And being fruitful and multiplying, a consequence of that is evolution. So it's a long answer, and I apologize for the length.
No, it's good.
Yeah.
And don't you kind of think, going off of that, I feel like more students need to hear that it is kind of the spectrum. I feel like it's been the either or. You're either a scientist or you're a person of faith. But as all of us know, we can so easily coexist, and it's just a question of each individual person figuring out where on that spectrum they feel most comfortable. But I don't know that message gets across. But I really drill that into my students and even have like a visual where they'll click in, like where are you most comfortable? And then when I display it, this class of 250, you'll see every bit of that spectrum is represented. And I'm like, that's the reality. So if you grew up thinking you only can be here or here, that's simply not true. So
Yeah, no, I think that's absolutely correct. It's a point I'm going to try to make tonight when I speak to a more general audience. But I think I think you're doing the Lord's work by doing that and enabling students to feel comfortable within their belief. The other thing is, I can rattle off a long list of very eminent scientists, including the field of evolution, who were Christians, and I will mention some of them tonight. And I'll jump right to my favorite one, and I'll talk about him tonight. And that is, who is the scientist who deserves the most credit for formulating rigorously what has come to be known as the Big Bang? Well, a lot of people say, well, it's Edwin Hubble, the astronomer, who discovered the redshift. He discovered empirical evidence for cosmic expansion, but he didn't explain why it was the case. Could it be Einstein? Actually, no. Einstein, for what I would call anti-theological reasons of his own, wanted to believe in a steady state universe, a universe that always was and always would be, and therefore we didn't have to think about the origin of the universe. But it was a Belgian physicist and astronomer named Georges Lemaitre, who was also a priest, who basically looked at Einstein's equations for general relativity and went to Einstein and say, these equations imply an expanding universe. And Lemaitre is now properly regarded as the author of the Big Bang. In other words, the person who put cosmic expansion on a firm scientific basis. And he was often asked, this doesn't sound like the Bible, this Big Bang thing happening 12, 13 billion years ago. And his answer was basically along the lines of the people who wrote scripture were enlightened, and they were enlightened on questions of sin and salvation. But on questions of science, they were either as knowledgeable or ignorant as other people at the same time. And the way I would answer it, did Jesus come to teach us quantum mechanics, nuclear physics, and molecular biology? The answer is no, he did not. He came to save our souls. And that's the message of Scripture. Other questions? Yeah.
So I taught evolution in Oklahoma, and it was a smaller class, and I had a group of students around who were talking to me about some of the conflict they were feeling with the class and religion at home. And one of the things they described to me was that the hardest part for them was understanding when a soul, if you look at sort of the evolution of humans.
I know where you're going. Go ahead.
When a soul entered into it, and how could I explain that? Of course, I'm not coming from that background,
Yeah.
so, but I thought it was fascinating that was part of the challenge for them.
Yeah, when I first wrote my book, Finding Darwin's God, it had just come out, and I was invited to give a lecture at Providence College, which is a Dominican college, Catholic college, right in Providence, right across town. Big rivals, for example, in ice hockey, where I live is very important. And I spoke to a group of students, and the reception was enthusiastic. And then I spoke to the brothers and priests in the theology group. And the first question I got is, what is your answer on ensoulment? I'm sorry, I've never heard that word before. Ensoulment means, when is a soul assigned? And my answer was, I really don't have any answer to that. But I will give you one paradox that I thought of right away, and another one that a bishop told me. So here's the first paradox. We believe that all human beings are given a soul. So you're born, you have an immaterial, spiritual soul. Let's consider as biologists the case of identical twins. Identical twins come from a single fertilized egg, which usually gets to the morula stage, a little cluster of cells, before it breaks into two. Does that morula have one soul, and then when it fragments into two, the soul splits? Or does only one of them get the soul? And we have to send up to heaven, emergency, we need another soul right here, right now. I always thought that was rather silly. So I was at lunch, I was asked with a couple other scientists to speak to a committee on science and technology for the United States Catholic Council of Bishops, which is a very influential organization within the church. And we were talking about stem cell research, and I'm a cell biologist. So I was talking with them about that. And I said casually, now I know the church teaches that the soul is infused at the moment of conception. And one of the bishops right next to me grabbed my arm and said, no, we don't. And I said, oh, enlighten me. And he said, well, what we teach is that we don't know the moment at which the soul is infused in the body. and therefore we want to err on the side of caution. And I thought, maybe that's a distinction without a difference, but it's a distinction I had never heard articulated before. Okay, so the question then is, okay, we're following from Australopithecus africanus, and we're going to Australopithecus robustus, and we're going to Homo nadali, we're going to Homo habilis. Where does that soul first show up? And my answer is very simple. I really have no idea. I'm not going to go into pre-Abrahamic theology in terms of when the first truly modern humans appeared, maybe 600,000 years ago. Did they have souls or not? Because that's it's almost more of a Greek tradition than it is an Abrahamic tradition, which is an important distinction. But I'm simply going to say that is a theological question for which I have no answer. But I also have no answer in the case of the identical twins or the moment of conception or anything else. What I, just as a person of faith, I regard the soul as the spiritual reflection of your individuality. It certainly is not the animus that people think the soul is what makes you alive. No, animals are alive. The soul is not what makes you conscious. I'm absolutely convinced that my Australian Shepherd is conscious and very smart, by the way. Consciousness is not unique to humans. But the question of the soul is one that, as a biologist, I just don't know how to address.
Yeah.
But I don't think evolution contradicts it either. You had your hand up?
Yeah, I was wondering if you've noticed like a shift in students' like perception of evolution over the course of your teaching career, whether it's like easier to teach evolution nowadays. And yeah, I guess.
You got to remember, I teach at a university with a 5% admit rate and average SAT scores that are just off the charts. Okay, and in biology class, every one of them thinks they're either going to win a Nobel Prize or they're going to go to the most prestigious medical schools in the country. They're all absolutely convinced of that. And more importantly, so are their parents, which can make life extremely difficult, excuse me. But I do believe I've noticed this shift at the public school level. And what I mean by that are state science standards. And where including evolution in the standards was once highly controversial in states like Oklahoma, like Texas, like Florida, and even in California, after a couple of Supreme Court decisions, after the Kitzmiller trial, after concerted efforts by organizations like mine, the National Center for Science Education, gradually, even the most conservative state boards of education writing standards have become convinced that an understanding of evolution, not belief, not just an understanding of evolution, has to be part of the state science standards. And that has enabled middle school and high school teachers throughout the country who occasionally face pressure from clergymen and parents about evolution to say, you know, I'm sorry, Reverend Jones, or I'm sorry, Ms. Smith, but it's in the state standards and we have to teach it. And that has taken a lot of pressure off teachers. And by taking pressure off teachers, it's enabled them to give a more complete understanding of biology to students. So I think things have gotten better. That chart I showed where we were just above Turkey, I don't know how much higher we are in the chart, but I do know that in the last 15 years, Americans' acceptance of evolution has increased to the point where about 60% of Americans accept evolution, and about 80% will accept it if you put the corollary in that evolution took place, but God guided it. I have to tell you, even though I'm a person of faith, no, I don't believe that God guided it. I think evolution is an independent process made possible by the laws of physics and chemistry. But I think it has become easier. And I have found fewer students who come to me at the beginning of the intro course worried about what I'm going to tell them about evolution. And for me, that's progress.
Yeah, and, oh, sorry.
Go ahead, keep going.
No, I just had a follow-up to that. So I taught evolution at BYU, a very
And
Christian institution, yeah.
and a few years ago, I gave the Tanner lecture.
Yes, that I went to.
You were there?
I was.
Oh my goodness. Oh, so the Tanner lecture is an annual lecture at BYU, and it takes place in Brigham Young Hall.
It takes place at the Bean Natural
Joseph Smith.
History Museum, yeah.
Well, I also gave a plenary lecture
Yep,
in what I think was either Brigham Young or Joseph Smith Hall
yes,
in front of 1,000 students.
yes.
And I have to tell you, no offense to North Carolina State, I'm having a wonderful visit here. I was never treated as royally as I was at BYU.
But essentially, so I've noticed that the undergraduate population, it like tends to be surprisingly susceptible, and accepting of evolution. But other populations potentially aren't. So if I'm speaking to, the Utah general public.
Oh, sure.
It's much different, and so you had a lot of experience with, parents of high school students with your softball versus, all the political things with your
I
textbook.
talked to other umpires about this too.
Oh, so I was wondering if your kind of guidelines or approaches shifts from, and how you explain to your students how they should talk to others about evolution.
Well, the first thing I try to explain in the general public is what motivates a scientist. And not for a second, should you believe that anybody goes into science, in biology in particular, and evolutionary biology specifically, to undermine someone else's religious beliefs. We don't choose the scientific fields we choose for polemical reasons. That's not the goal. The goal is simply understanding. And we want to understand, evolutionary biologists want to understand the biological history of this remarkable planet. And we also want to understand the forces that drove that history, because they are driving it today. And that's the whole motivation. It's not to undermine faith. It's not to convince you to be a liberal socialist. The goal is simply to understand. And I like to believe that I can get them to see me just as a person who was a fairly bright kid in school. I have a photograph of myself at age of 11, sitting in the basement of our grimy house in New Jersey, next to my brand new Gilbert chemistry set on the table and my very first microscope. I have much bigger microscopes now. But I went into science, again, not for political reasons or religious reasons, but because I wanted to be a scientist, because I thought understanding things was the coolest thing in the world. Do we have time for at least one more?
No, we're gonna have, let me just say, right, the discussion this evening, right, there's a very formal talk, but after that, we have plenty of time for discussion. So please come tonight if you have more questions, and we can continue this. So thank you.